Hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel on citizens' views of and interactions with the police. My name is Temitope Oriola, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology, University of Alberta, and I'm delighted to chair this session. I'd like to start with a territorial acknowledgement. The University of Alberta, the place from which this conference is hosted, is on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route to the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Diné, and Nakota Sioux. We acknowledge all the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. We acknowledge their enormous sacrifices and ongoing quest for a fairer and more equitable society. We have two presentations on this panel today. Our third presenter is unable to join us, and therefore each of the presenters now has 25 minutes. And that gives us about 30 minutes for Q&A. Now, that means that all questions should kindly be reserved for the Q&A session after all presenters have been able to speak. So I ask for those who are on the panel and those who are watching on YouTube, wherever you are around the world, do type in your questions to the chat box, or if you're on YouTube, I believe there's a space there for you to put your questions and comments. So, and we welcome them, and we will have a good half an hour thereabout to take your questions and comments. I'm excited about the two papers, and first off is a paper on French minorities' experience with the police, and the presenter is Guillaume Rioux from the University of Grenoble, France. Over to you.
Yes. Hello, everybody again. So I have renamed my conference, the title. So now the title is Race, Place, and Police Symbolic Power, French Minorities' Experience with the Police. So I want first to thank Sandra and the organizer of this conference, and thank you for the invitation. And so my name is Guillaume Rioux. I am a political scientist at the Université de Grenoble. So I will first, do you hear me well? Okay, perfect. So I will start with my research question. So how can we characterize French minorities, and especially racial minorities' experience with the police? What is the role of race and place? Place means being an inhabitant of the French banlieue, or so to speak, inner cities. And what are the consequences of minorities' experience with the police in terms of racialization, stigmatization, and social divisions in French society? So I will say a few words about the contextual and theoretical background of this presentation. In the French context, you tend to have an opposition of race versus place. There is historically and still for some part today a French academic silence about race. Race in its very sociological meaning, the very fact that people are perceived as white, blacks, Maghrebis, and the fact that these make differences in social life. So in the French context, including to some extent the academic context, you have this idea that race has everything to do with the US context and nothing to do with the French context. What is obviously wrong, there is a historical production and use of racial categories throughout French history, notably the history of colonization. For example, you had this official category of Français musulmans d'Algérie, which means French Muslims from Algeria, but it has nothing to do with religion and everything to do about race. Now you have in recent years, there is the emergence of a new generation of French scholars investing the study of the ways race as a common sense category was and is silent in the French context, but there is still denial and refusal. So when you are dealing with race and discrimination in the academic context, you are potentially facing disqualification. Notably, you would be accused these days of wokeism, what means you are supposed to propose identity politics and being an enemy of the French Republic. And the current French political context is very favorable to this disqualification of the study of racialization and racial discriminations. So talking more specifically about discriminations, till the end of the 90s, there are officially, from the point of view of public authorities, there are no racial or ethnic discrimination in France. The relevant variable is supposed to be social class. So there is this idea that with all controls in place, so to speak, there would be no causal effect of race. And the recognition of discriminations faces even more resistances when it comes to police discriminations. The first study aimed at systematically testing the existence or not of French police profiling is as late as 2007. And it was funded by the Open Justice Society, so it was not funded by the French government or a French academic institution. So there is, in France, race tend to be, the reality of race tend to be ignored, denied, or at least minimized. This is not the case of place or the banlieue. The peculiarity of French disrupted urban suburbs is an official reality. So it is both a common sense and an administrative fact. You have some dedicated policies targeting the French banlieue. As regard to the police, since the 80s, there is a growing movement of dedicated police forces targeting the banlieue, or so-called sensitive French neighborhoods. And when it comes, so when it comes to collective identities or collective identifications, there is this question of whether inhabitants of the French banlieue are self-identifying as members of a racial group or as members of a special group of the territory of the banlieue. In France and in other national contexts as well, you have this statement, which is made notably in an article by Loïc Vacant, Tom Slater, and Virgilio Pereira. This statement that territorial stigmatization or special tent became a major forgotten source of what Bourdieu called symbolic power, or what we can call in this case rather symbolic defamation. So in the French context, the reality of place, that is to say the fact that being or not an inhabitant of the banlieue makes some differences in social life, like being discriminated or stigmatized, is often evoked to deny the reality of race. It is true when we talk about minorities' self-identifications or identities, the idea that minorities from the banlieue would identify as a territorial as opposed to a racial group. And when it comes to police mistreatment and police profiling, there is this question of whether the police is targeting inhabitants of the banlieue who happen to be also racial minority members, or target members of racial minorities as such. Even if, since a few years, we know that the police is targeting both, but the French police is also profiling members of French racial minorities as such. Okay, I just have to check because you still hear me well? Okay, thank you. On the other hand, the symbolic construction of race and the symbolic construction of the banlieue are very entangled realities in France, especially. They go hand in hand. In the article I just mentioned from Vacan and his colleagues, they will write that the banlieue or inner cities are racialized, which means they are perceived through the lens of racial alterity. So there are various ways to show this, to show that race and place are entangled in the French context. One way to show it is from electoral sociology. We know that in France, there is a very silent political and electoral cleavage, which is the immigration insecurity issue. And we are talking a lot in the French public debate about this immigration insecurity issue. It is always present in the public debate. And when we are talking about this issue, we are always talking about the banlieue, and implicitly we are talking about race, not only about immigrants, but about people from ethnic or racial minority background. So part of my work these last years and this communication aims at dealing with what I would call the French race-place puzzle as regard to minorities' experience with the police and police symbolic power. So the question is, what is the role of race and place as regard to minorities' experience with the police? Do members of those minorities feel profiled and more generally targeted and stigmatized by the police? If so, how? Which means in relation to which police actions and as members of which group, and groups defined in terms of what? In terms of race, in terms of place, or ends. So I will be very quick, but about data and methodology, but questions will be very welcome in the discussion. Very quickly, my reflection is based on several surveys, so both international and national surveys, and both quantitative surveys, so attitudes towards the police studies, and qualitative surveys, some of which are published in international journals and others in French journals. And for this presentation, I will mostly base my analysis on a collective survey with 6 other colleagues. So it is a qualitative survey which was conducted from 2014 to 2017 in 6 banlieue neighborhoods, so 6 cities in France, and 3 inner city neighborhoods in Canada, Great Britain, and the US. The survey includes mostly racial minority members. So we performed 2,045 in-depth interviews about subjective experience of discrimination stigmatization. And there is now, since 2021, a collective book, which is called L'épreuve de la discrimination, and it is forthcoming in English, but in quite some time. And I also mentioned that the corpus was submitted to a systematic collective analysis with the software Atlas TA. Okay, so the results. First, I will mention survey results for the 6 neighborhoods in France. The first big result is that the subjective experience of discrimination, stigmatization is very widespread in our French corpus. Most interviewees report an experience or several experiences of discrimination. Race is the most, so in France, race is the most often evoked criteria of discrimination, as in other countries. So it is about 7 interviewees out of 10 who would evoke race as a criteria for discrimination, followed by, for half interviewees, religion, which means being a Muslim, and for more than 1/3 of the interviewees' territory, living in the banlieue as a source of discrimination. So race is as silent in France as in foreign fields, so US, Canada, and Great Britain. And the territory, so perceived territorial stigma or discrimination, is more silent in France. It's about the double than in other territories. And I don't know why. We did not really reflect about it, so to be honest. So the experience of, other results, the experience of discrimination, stigmatization leads to reactive self-identifications. So interviewees would often identify to a group or a category in reaction to perceived discrimination. So interviewees would say us. So now the question is, how do they name this us? And the result shows that, and it is also a statement from other surveys which I conducted, it is not either race, either the territory. Most often interviewees would use racial categories. They would say us Maghrebians or us blacks or us black and Maghrebians, but also and often at the same time, they will say us inhabitants of the neighborhood. This often in the same sentence or sequence. So it is the same group, the same us, which is defined both in racial and spatial or territorial terms. For example, an interviewee would say, a guy who is a Karim, so Karim is a typical Maghrebian name, a guy who is a Karim and who lives in a banlieue neighborhood. Or an interviewee would say, in those banlieue neighborhoods where there are only blacks and Maghrebians. In fact, there are not only black and Maghrebians, there are always white people, so to speak, in the French banlieue. So both race and neighborhood are silent in the French context and tend to be silent altogether as a source of self-identification. Second result, also the experience with the police was not a focus of the survey. We did not systematically ask about experience with the police, except me, I must admit, I did that in my interviews. 1/3 of the mentioned experiences of discrimination, stigmatization were experiences with the police. Those experiences were diverse, and they include personal contacts, like being mistreated by the police, being stigmatized by the police, and they include racial profiling, but racial profiling was not central. Maybe this is a surprising statement, and I leave it for the discussion. Those negative and those experiences of discrimination by the police did provoke a feeling of injustice more often than other experiences of discrimination, for example, discrimination at the workplace. And they were more often associated to the evocation of being an inhabitant of the banlieue, even if once again it was entangled with race. Okay, so now my third result, and this is true for this survey and for other surveys which I conducted as well. Often the experience with the police is less interpersonal contact, as it is observing what the police is doing in the neighborhood. So it is observing or knowing about police actions in the neighborhood, or the police targeting the neighborhood of the interviewee. So here I will talk of the interviews which I performed in Mistral, which is a banlieue neighborhood of Grenoble, where I'm living. So at the time of the survey, there were recurrent massive police operations in this neighborhood targeting drug hotspots and aimed at harassing drug dealers in the neighborhood. So interviewees, there are many differences in the interviewees as regard to what they say about the police, but here I will take about what they have in common. So the interviewees, at the very least, they dislike the existence of drug dealing in their neighborhood. So they adhere to the police goal of repressing drug dealing. But first, they were shocked by the brutality of what they describe as military-like police operations. Most feel physical fear for themselves and most of all for their children. Second, they judge these police operations are clearly inefficient, if not counterproductive. And third, at the end of the day, many interviewees express some doubt about the aims and legitimacy of these police operations, which means that they would say that maybe the aim of the police is something like sending a message, but they are very unsure about what this message is and to who it is sent. So they finish to express a doubt about the very target of the police. There is an hesitation, and this is important because I show that in other banlieue neighborhoods with sometimes in very different banlieue contexts. So there is an hesitation between the police is targeting the neighborhood, and in the neighborhood is targeting drug dealers, and the police is targeting the neighborhood and its inhabitants at large. This has something to do about the Foucauldian notion of normalization and the production of at-risk groups, but I won't talk about this here. Maybe we'll talk about it in the discussion. So at the end of the day, there is a feeling expressed by many interviewees that the police operations are targeting and stigmatizing the neighborhood and its inhabitants at large. So the police are seen as targeting us, defined as both racial and spatial terms. For example, an interviewee would say, in the eye of the police, we also belong to the bad guys. The way they act and disrespect us through police operations shows that in their eyes, we belong to the bad guys. Or an interviewee will report what her child say. Her child say, "Mommy, what are we?" It's a shame. It means that the guy is saying that police operations bring shame on us as a group targeted by the police. So I come to my conclusion. Maybe I will be a bit shorter than 25 minutes, but it will leave room for discussion. So the first conclusion is that both race and place are silent in the French context as regard to the experience of discrimination, stigmatization by the police. And this encourages self-identifications, which are both racial and spatial or territorial. So in this regard, police actions participate in a form of racialization to the extent that it renders both racial and territorial identity silent. It often renders racial identity silent through territorial identities and via the police targeting of banlieue neighborhoods. So here, maybe, I will add that white people, because I interviewed also white people in the same neighborhood, and they never feel stigmatized by police operations, never. There is never us stigmatized by police operation. Second, police symbolic power, which can be defined as the power of the police to characterize groups as normal or deviant. Often the police symbolic power, as it is reflected by what the interviewees say, is not as much about how police officers behave. A lot of interviewees would say that police officers do their job, but about police actions. Especially when you have some interviewees, and there are many of them who say that they do not have personal interaction with police officers. I did not talk a lot about, maybe we will talk in the discussion about the consequences on minorities' construction of citizenship in the French context, because in the French survey in general, we have big evidence that there is a feeling of unfair treatment by the police and by other public institutions as well, but unfair treatment by the police is associated strongly with the idea of injustice and the idea that if you contact the justice to say that you've been the object of discrimination, if you try to go to a trial, you will seldom, if not never, obtain justice. And maybe I should mention here that the first step, if you are the victim of a discrimination in France in general, the first step and the things which is the most known by the interviewees is that you can and maybe you have to go to the police to say that you have been discriminated or you have been the object of racism. Okay, and so this reminds us that perception of the police has to do with collective identifications and social divisions. And the French situation of public and political debate from this point of view is a bit, I don't know how to say, it's a bit in some way negative. It is a bit, the debate is framed a lot in terms of being with the police or being against the police. And being with the police will be often interpreted as being against real or supposed deviant groups from the banlieue. Okay, and so I will leave room for the exchange, and I will just take the opportunity to say that I'm working on this subject for many years, and I think now for me it's time to have more international exchanges and maybe international collaborations about the way racialization notably can be seen as a policy feedback or the result more specifically of policing and territorial policy. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you for that. That was enjoyable, and for me it was reminiscent of the 2005 French riots following the electrocution of 2 French youth who were allegedly being chased by police. And as you may remember, that incident was marked. There was some sort of anniversary for at least a couple of years after that, with scores of cars being burned all around France. So I'm interested in knowing more, what the situation has been since then. But in particular, your concept of reactive self-identification. I think that's a very fascinating concept, and we'll talk more about that during the Q&A. Next up, all the way from the University of Toronto, we have Ron Levi, and he will be speaking on professionalism in the vernacular, how arrested individuals define policing as work and relation. Over to you, Ron.
Thank you, everyone. While I just share my screen for a second, I'll ask Guillaume if he can see it. Guillaume can see it. Good. Okay, very good. We can see it. So thank you, everyone. And it's a real joy to come after Guillaume, I have to say. Guillaume and I think we're on email and exchange once together, but we've never met either in person or virtually. So these conferences are already doing their work, I think, which is good. And substantively, I was taking notes during Guillaume's talk, but if I hear Guillaume's talk correctly, it's sort of a cultural and political sociology of the state as seen through policing, or as articulated through policing, at least that's what I heard, and including the categories that people use and think of when they think about the police. And so I think there's going to be close resonance with the paper that I'm giving today. The paper I'm giving today, you've heard the title, but I think the more important part is actually the fact that we're 4 co-authors on this. That's important because credit is important and co-authorship is important, but it's also important because it tells you something about the talk. Ronit Dinevitzer is lead. She's a sociologist of the professions. I'm next. I do work on law and on crime, but mostly with a focus on political and cultural questions. Todd Fogelsong also at Toronto, works on police and justice reform, and Holly Campeau, all the way, as Topi says, at the University of Alberta, does work on policing and police culture. And so we think this paper really brings together these dimensions of policing to think through the question today. So let me just go here. Good. So the broad project is really a question about culture and legality. Right? And there's an underlying question that underlies this paper as well as others, which is when people are faced with experiences of institutional failures and institutions that fail them, what do they do? How do they make sense of the fact that they keep relying on these institutions, that these institutions are still salient, right? So we have a series of papers, some on how people make sense, the systems they avoid, the mental health consequences, a sense of collective memory, including in the French context, so maybe Guillaume and I can speak. And we draw here on research in sociology, including cultural and political sociology, and in moral philosophy, to really think through how people imagine institutions when they fail them. So if you think empirically, then where are we going to study this today? We're looking at two cities. This is Baltimore and Cleveland. You'll see images of both places right here. These are well known to people who study policing and crime. And in particular, these are two cities in the US that are currently under, as the word, a consent decree. Now, consent decrees are the result of lawsuits by the Federal Department of Justice in the United States. These were initiated under the Obama administration. The Trump administration had refused to continue the process of consent decrees, but we can talk about that. But as a result of these consent decrees, there are two things happening that are of interest to me. The first is that the police are under judicial supervision in both cities to improve their practices. That's a series of reform proposals. The second is that part of that consent decree includes interviews with individuals who have recently been arrested in these cities within 24 hours of their arrest. And that is, in fact, how our team has access to both cities and the data we'll be talking about today. This comes, slide should have come earlier, I think, as sort of the next iteration of a project that has had a couple of publications so far. The first, in Social Problems, really focuses on, not why do individuals, when they know these are individuals who have been arrested, but speaking to them as individuals, as residents of these cities. Why do they keep calling the police for help? We don't ask that question, but we're interested in how they make sense of the fact that they do. And the sort of one-line finding there is that the very act of calling on the police and calling on the state, even when you anticipate it will fail you, provides a kind of symbolic form of recognition. That's the first sort of finding. The second finding is when you talk to individuals, again, within 24 hours of their arrest, about how they imagine police reform, what they imagine could go better. They invoke several different moral orders, or what in the French context is economies of worth, in terms of thinking about reform proposals that they would imagine. And these are both complementary, and I'm not going to say contradictory, but sometimes in tension, right? They want police to acknowledge them as equal citizens, like others in other neighborhoods, but also as distinct, as whether that's issues of race, whether that's issues of place, as Guillaume says, but it's this combination of drawing on both the register of equality and difference, of law and of community, of respect, but also rapport, right? It's this combination that we find in the second paper on the screen. The current project, which you'll hear about today, is to turn it a little bit, to instead ask something else from these same interviews that we've done. We ask about professions, and we say we're interested in thinking of policing not as a profession, that's not actually where we're going, but we're interested in getting at people's ideas of what police professionalism might look like. So we're not engaged in some kind of folk dispute about whether or not policing really is a profession, or is it really a craft, or is it an art, right? That's not our place, really. But we're interested in the language and cultural categories that people use when they think about what police professionalism is. And so the classic work on professions is on your screen. This is really thinking through what makes a profession? It's having a monopoly of a certain kind of knowledge, having legal authority to have that knowledge, this sort of thing. We're interested in a cultural turn, which is what does it mean to be and to be seen as a professional, right? Rather than what does it mean to be in a profession, or to decide whether they're in a profession. And from this lens, professionalism, that's the third bullet point, is really the meaning of the work, right? Things like pride or devotion or the quality or a sense of responsibility, right? Anyone from this perspective can be a professional or can be professional in their work, more accurately put, even if they are not in a profession with a capital P, right? And the research to date from this lens has really been, and I'll say all of it, but certainly the majority, has been whether individuals seeking to make a claim about them being in a profession make claims about their own professionalism, right? I deserve a monopoly on this as a lawyer, as an accountant, as something, because I'm a professional, whatever that might mean. Or from the other end of the sort of spectrum, from on high, the overseer, the regulator, saying, you have not been professional enough here, right? We instead have a focus on professionalism from the publics, right? I'll object to the idea from below, but from the publics, right? And thinking about professionalism now, not as a claim to jurisdiction, right? I get to be a professional because, and not as a way to police professionals, you have not been professional enough, but as a series as a lens for inquiring into people's moral expectations of those individuals, in our case here, police. Right? So we asked arrested individuals as part of a battery of questions within 24 hours of their arrest, this wild question, right? Which is, based on your own experiences, how would you describe the way the Baltimore or Cleveland Police Department polices, right, where you live? And would you see it as highly, mostly, somewhat professional or unprofessional? Right now, there's a closed-ended part to this, but it's the open-ended question that we're at today. And this is the core part of the data you're going to see today. But I should say that this also came up spontaneously in the series of other questions, right? So sometimes when talking about the neighborhood, some of the individuals we spoke to would say, they're not being professional when they do this, right? So professionalism came up often spontaneously, though, of course, modally, it comes up more than modally. It comes up when we talk about this question. The total number of interviews we're looking at is somewhere approaching 190 face-to-face interviews. Happy to talk about those more in questions. I think Holly Campo is on this call too. She can also, as part of that team, can take some of these questions too. Between 2017 and 2019, I've highlighted 2019 because the data you'll see today come from that year. The 2017 data you'll see in the earlier papers that I put on the screen. So what we've done is relying, and we're going to go through some quotes, but relying on the quotes that we've seen and that we've been able to code. And this is a first cut, right? So sort of want to leave some room for discussion and questions on this, right? This is a first cut. We've moved between theory and data to come up with a series of 4 ways in which individuals we spoke to talked about professionalism in policing. Right. And so what you'll see for each of these is a title that we've given it. You'll see underneath it some of the literature that we've relied on to make sense of what we heard. Right. And then next to it, you'll see, and I apologize, I can't see my own screen. You'll see next to it, you'll see our definition of what we mean. Right. So one aspect of professionalism that we heard is that residents expect police, to do the job, right? And we'll go through some of those quotes. But show up on time, right? Don't be lazy, right? This is very task-oriented at some level. And when you do it, don't lie, don't cheat, right? Just do the work. Right? And that, we think, there's a literature that underwrites that, which is in the italics, under minimal competence. We also heard, though, in response to the professionalism question, People say something else, that what it meant to be professional in this context meant to be ethical. Ethical in a kind of one-to-one kind of Emmanuel Levinas kind of sense, right? What did it mean to be before the other, to be before them as residents of the community, right? And so that really we've thought about as residents expecting police to act honorably in their relationships, right? Be good, right? Don't just do the job and not cheat, but be good, treat me well, treat me with respect, right? These sorts of things. The third that we focused on, actually, I want to take you to the bottom left, was reflexivity and learning. At the bottom left, you'll see that one. And that was to be a professional, actually, to be professional, was residents' expectations that the police would learn as they went. I mean, that, after all, that's what we talk about when we talk about practicing medicine, right? The theory is that we're practicing, presumably we're learning and getting better as we go, yeah? So, I mean, I don't know, I hope so. So, right, so practicing law, right? This idea that a professional, what it means to be professional means learning from situations, learning from mistakes, and getting better, right? So we heard some of that. And on the bottom right, we heard that a sense of this professionalism is what we're calling a kind of pragmatism. We're calling it relational citizenship. We're obviously fumbling for a term here, right? But this was, we heard people saying, look, what it means to be professional in this context for police, it means experiment sometimes, try something new. It meant don't just work within your sphere. Think broadly about the neighborhood or the community, right? Try to solve problems that aren't, move out of your lane, right? In a sense, right? See it as a vocation, right? Experiment, move out of your lane, this sort of thing. So taken together, that's our 4 dimensions. And then I have about 11 minutes according to my timer. So I'll go through quotes for each of these and just to give you a sense of where we are. When I go through them, you're going to have, I think, the experience that we had, which is, well, is this one quote, exactly minimal competence, or is it more of an ethical relationship, right? Look, that's a conversation I'm happy to have, partly because we're still trying to figure out the bright lines between these. There aren't bright lines between these, right? But we do think we're capturing 4 dimensions of what people are thinking about. So let's look at what we're calling minimal competence. This was kind of effort, right? Don't just sit in your car on your phones while someone's being shot over there, right? Response time has to be better, right? And they're unprofessional, one individual says. Sometimes I'll say one guy, I should say about 80% or so of the people we spoke to were men. Of the 190. So I apologize if I lapse into that sometimes, because sometimes I see them in my head, and so I know who I'm talking about. But one individual says, they unprofessional, meaning they just do what's needed for the time being, right? They're just doing the minimal amount of effort, and that was seen as unprofessional, right? But it meant to be professional meant to give more. To give what? Kind of care and discretion, right? Evaluate the situation. Look what's going on around you. Don't just go in and put your hands on people, right? So have some care. That's what professionalism, the beginning of that quote, looks like, right? This is what our individual is saying, right? And clearly, professionalism, minimal competence that we're calling, also is, don't break the rules, right? Now, whether these are true or not is really not my at least concern in this talk, right? These are the cultural and political narratives that people are working with about what it means to be professional or not in policing, right? He says, the unprofessional, a lot are lying on police reports, right? Someone else saying, it's unprofessional because there's no reason I couldn't have been told what I was being handcuffed for, right? And seeing this as at least a flouting, if not a breaking of the rules. And other individuals saying, they take our drugs and our money, but why do they take our money? I guess they're supposed to take the drugs, but you can't take our money, right? He's trying to think this through. They're doing dirty cop stuff, right? Planting drugs on people, right? So this sort of perceptions of actual rule breaking we're putting in there with minimal competence. And I'll remind you all, this is in response to questions about professionalism, right? So that's how this is the response this is the response to that prompt, right? But it wasn't just that. It was the second part of the quadrant, right? It was also this one-to-one relationship, right? Listen and don't prejudge, right? Professional, this individual tells us in Cleveland, is not being disrespectful, right? Let me talk, right? Letting you talk. You're trying to say something and they tell you, shut the fuck up, right? Instead, let me talk. Professional manners, the next respondent tells us, right? That's how he hears professionalism. Professional manners, like hearing both sides of the story, right? Again, listening, not prejudging. And then the next one says, it's actually gotten more professional over time, right? And he says, and this was in Baltimore in 2019, he says, look, things are getting more professional over time. And what's the indicator that they're relying on to say this is that the officers are being a little more caring. They're not being strict robots. They're being people or people persons, right? They're speaking and listening instead of just judging you straight off the bat, right? So these are the data, if you think of it in those terms, that individuals are using to assess the professionalism of the police. And with that listening and not prejudging is a bit of empathy. Right? They should see our perspective, right? They should see why is it that an individual who's being arrested doesn't want to sit on the dirty street. If I've got new clothes on, I don't want to sit on the ground and get dirty. That's unprofessional, right? So a kind of, again, we've lumped together here listening and not prejudging with a kind of empathy as both part of what we're thinking of as ethical relationships. It might not be the right title, but that's what we're trying to really put our fingers on. The next, the third part of the quadrant, which you'll remember being at the bottom left, is the learning and reflexivity of what professionalism is. Right? So the first individual says, the police, I'll give you some context for this quote. The police often hear that no one likes to be around them. Right? And so this individual says, well, maybe as a cop, you should think about why that is. Why does no one want to be around you? Why does no one like you? And he says, well, maybe you should step back as a professional and think, it can't just be them. It can't just be the individuals being policed. It can't just be because of them. It must be something that we have to improve, right? And he compares it to someone who has a drinking problem. And the longer part of the quote says, it's one thing if one person says it to you, but if your cousin and your auntie also say it to you, you start to think, well, maybe I really do have a drinking problem, right? And this individual says, that's where we're at, right? If people are telling you the same thing, no matter how you feel, you've got to try to understand and get a different perspective, right? That's professionalism. Right? Another part of learning is oversight, right? Different commissioners are being changed out. And that's why it's better now, one individual said. And then another says, look, they've got to get more training, more learning. They've got to learn, and they have to learn what he calls having some kind of social degree for dealing with people. So learning, whether that was learning from the fact that no one likes you, whether it's learning from authority figures like commissioners, or whether that's learning by you should go out and get another degree, was part of what it meant for this individual to be professional. The last part of the professionalism grid that we produced from the data is what we're trying to put our finger on of be pragmatic, be innovative, try, see it as a vocation, don't just do the job, right? And so some of it is kind of domain expansion, right? This is what I was trying to say when I was saying, don't just stay in your lane, right? At least broaden the lane. Right. So one example from Cleveland, that actually turned out to be both from Cleveland. One example is, if there's an older woman who needs to have her home fixed, maybe you guys should go out and do it. Get some paint, get some wood, rebuild the neighborhood. Right. That's clearly domain expansion of some level. Right. Another is an individual who says, listen, I never went to private schools. I'm not sure why he tells us that. I never went to private schools. I was never given a lunchbox. But if I see an officer in the neighborhood who's playing basketball with the kids, that's when you have a genuine soul, he says. That makes me cry. And he even says, if you're on patrol and you're protecting someone, but if you can go make a kid happy, stop protecting and go do that, right? Stuff like that, that makes me feel like that's genuine care. He says that's genuine policing. Right? So this sort of, I'm thinking of this as domain expansion, not in order to say that's not the policeman's job, police officer's job. That's not what I'm trying to say. But they're saying, look, expand your set, right? A bit here about experimentation, right? An individual also says, look, maybe what you should do is when you go on patrol, take young guys from the neighborhood with you, and they'll tell you what you're really seeing when you see it, right? Experiment in your driving around by having collaborations with individuals from the neighborhood in the car, and you'll see something different, right? So this idea of experimenting is, I think, really interesting. And there's part of the quote that's gone now where he says, that would be really interesting, he says, right? That's because he's saying, that's what it means to be a professional. And the last part is a kind of everyday pragmatism, right? Be part of the neighborhood, be in a relationship outside of your lane. And he's thinking back to when he was younger, there was a particular white police officer who would just come in and check up on him and say things like, hey, are you staying out of trouble? Okay, that's good. You're staying in school, right? Checking up on me, seeing how I'm doing. That's how police officers should be. So that's going to bring it together. Those are our four. This is the same slide you saw before. And then just to conclude, right? So, we see this as, in a way, learning from, but also counterposing to longstanding work that tries to identify whether policing is really a profession or really a craft, or is it really a science, or is it a poetic system, right? What is policing? We're instead focusing on the logic of the ism, right? The professionalism as a cultural form to get at people's expectations for the moral agency that police can be imagined to offer. And here we're drawing on work by Spillman and Brophy, who think of professionalism as a cultural form, right? We think it's an extreme case, and that's actually, we think, a good thing, right? Because this is professionalism often in contentious situations, sometimes involuntary moments, at those moments of arrest, let's say, right? These are all individuals who have just been arrested within 24 hours, right? So it's an extreme case, but in that sense, we think it's good to think with, really, as a sort of edge case. And we think it gives us insight not only into policing, but also, I think, like Guillaume, into the politics and culture of the state. And because what we see in here, what comes through, are also sort of some of the parallel questions around recognition, around legality, around what it means to have a civil sphere. So I'll stop there. I think I'm going to give back 40 seconds to Tope to do what he likes with them. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Ron. That was very, very interesting presentation. Now, I was making notes as you were speaking, in part because just hearing how you were articulating those quotes from your participants and all of that, for me, it invoked some part of the work that I had done, and several people on the call would be aware of this. I did serve as special advisor to the government of Alberta on Police Act review last year. And one of the things that I had to grapple with was explaining in my reports the implications of treating policing as a set of manual skills that can be acquired with a grade 12 level education and 6 months of basic training. I'm aware that those recommendations have been prepared into an amendment bill as announced by the Lieutenant Governor, but without the benefit of peeping into any of those reports, extemporaneously I knew that the three main things that I had focused on vis-a-vis professionalizing policing centered on accountability, civilian oversight, and issues in relation to police use of force. But it's fascinating hearing the views from the streets regarding police conduct and professionalism, what that means to them, and how in reality that can be done. And I, often in engagement with governmental stakeholders, but speak to the Law Society of Alberta, for instance, or the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and the kinds of regulatory framework that they have, and how they deal with misconduct of their members, and so on and so forth. But enough from me. We're going to open things up now. We have quite some time, 24 or so minutes, if my timing is correct, for our Q&A. So I know that some questions have come in, and we will just dive into them. So first question, Ron, do police consider themselves to be, quote, street level bureaucrats, where they have a high level of discretion in applying rules which are formally rigid but have room for interpretation in practice?
So look, there's the easy answer here is I'm sure it's true, but I don't know, right? So I'm sure it's true, but I don't know. That's actually the answer. But look, I think that's right. The person on this call who does know the answer to this is Holly Compo, who's done tremendous work on police culture. And so she'd be best poised, and maybe Tope, I don't know if we're allowed to bring her on, but that might be one way to answer this. But I will, so I'll push a bit on the question, right? Because however police see themselves, what struck us in this research is how others, call them the clients, the receivers, right? whatever you want to call them, right? See them, right? And in this question about rules that are rigid but have discretion, right? So the paper we did in the American Journal of Cultural Sociology is very clear that in the demand for recognition that we heard, it is about equality, but it is, as I said earlier, about compassion, about reaching out. And that maps, I mean, I don't say one-to-one, but that maps onto the issue of discretion that I think you raise, where individuals were saying, look, understand where I'm coming from. Understand that my life is hell. Understand that I just got divorced and lost my job, right? And they don't use the words discretion in the interviews that I recall, but they were looking for moments of empathy, moments of connection, moments of compassion. And those might reside in the thing that, from a street level bureaucrat's perspective, we can call discretion. I'll say one last thing before turning back to Tope or maybe Holly, is the one quote that didn't appear on the screen, just for lack of time, was one individual saying, look, I understand that when you arrest me, if you see me doing something, you've got to arrest me. But when it's that you didn't see me and just heard about it, don't you have to get a criminal summons to do it, right? And he was articulating that it wasn't professional, the fact that he was brought in, right? So he had ideas, whether they're accurate or not in terms of what the legal rules are. I mean, at some level, who cares, right? If these are the narratives that are motivating people to interpret social life and political life in particular ways, his analysis was that was not professional, right? Because he wasn't following the rules. And so this question about discretion and interpretation comes up both at the empathy side and at the isn't there a rule that you didn't follow side when we speak to participants. Tope, I'll turn it to you and your choice about whether we can bring in Holly to answer the other part.
Thanks, Ron. Ollie, if Ollie would like to jump in, that's absolutely fine.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess, that's exactly how I would have, and especially drawn on the American Journal of Cultural Sociology piece when we're reflecting on this idea of how discretion would figure from the arrested person's viewpoint, for sure. But I guess what I'll say is from the policing standpoint, from the actual officer viewpoint, well, first I'll say we didn't get to interview police in the consent decree cities. So we didn't actually get to do interviews with police in Cleveland or Baltimore. However, I'm reproducing this work in Canada. And so where I do interview arrested individuals and then sort of bring lessons learned from that to police officer interviews. And one thing that came out of this was, while they do definitely perceive themselves as street level bureaucrats, right, that this level of discretion is not only important to their work, but partly why they got into this line of work, right, that they could use this particular know-how and their skill sets in working with people to make a difference, right? That's very much a motivator to get into this area of work. But that increasingly their ability to wield discretion is on the decline, right? So they see themselves as more constrained by increasing mechanisms of oversight, the more and more CCTV, body cameras being around. And so they actually see these changes in policing as limiting their ability to wield discretion in more creative ways. But it's interesting because what we're finding in the arrestee interviews is that the type of discretion they're looking for is probably not the same type of discretion that police are looking to use, right? So that's why we think it's important to bring together both perspectives, and that's why we want to do that. Wish we could have done it in the US cities, but because that both sides of that perspective, like whether they define discretion the same way, is, I think, an empirical question.
All right, thank you, Holly. And I see Kevin's hand. Kevin, I will get to you in a moment. This question is for Guillaume. You briefly mentioned Foucault's concept of normalization and how it applies to the neighborhoods you conducted research in. Would you please be able to elaborate on that? Okay.
Yes, of course. Thank you for this question. Yes, there are the question about this notion of Foucault normalization would be, okay, people are stigmatized as members of a group. How does this stigmatization work? So here it's not about, we don't know directly about how the police think, but we know about how people from the banlieue think about the way the police think. And okay, we'll say what is interesting to me in the Foucauldian notion of normalization. The background is that I avoid I try not to work with the notion of stereotype. I think stereotype is too problem. There are too many problems. It's more, to me, it's more a result than a process. So, so Michel Foucault is talking. It's a few pages in one of his books about normalization, and it's something very precise. It's the process. It's come from medicine, a medical problem during the 18th century. And there is a medical treatment of this problem. You distinguish between groups, between categories of the population, according to different criteria. It can be age, it can be location in the city, it can be many criteria. And you say there are some groups where there are more people who are contaminated. So in the group, you maintain the distinction between people who are contaminated and people who are not contaminated. You don't think that everyone is contaminated in the group. But if there are more contaminations in a group, in a category, you have this feeling that there must be a problem with this category. Maybe the category at large is more prone to contamination. And so you must have a state, a focus of public action on this category. So I will say it is a way to stigmatize, because it is very, you can apply that to thinking, to the fact that there are, you think there are a lot of delinquents in a group or in a neighborhood. You have different reasonings. You can think that all people, for example, in a banlieue neighborhood, they have deviant behavior. So this is one thing, and this exists. But you can think that not all people have deviant behavior, but there are a lot of deviant behavior, and maybe it says something about the group at large. Okay, I think it is the exact same thing, in fact, as what Pontassis and Pemberton are talking about when they talk about suspect communities. I don't know if you know this literature about suspect communities. It was at first about Irish people being targeting by the police, and now it is about Muslim minorities being targeted by the police in Great Britain. And so it's what interviewees in some neighborhoods would say. They would not say the police is thinking I am a delinquent. You know, for example, you are talking to an old lady, an old Maghrebian lady. She will never say the police. They think that I'm dealing drug. They will rather say, because there are people who are dealing drugs in the neighborhood, they tend to think that we are all bad. Okay, and I have an interest in that because I try to reflect, to pursue the reflection on stigmatization and racism, and think about how it works. And Hans and Q mentioned the culture of the state, and I'm especially interested on my interest is on how the state and public action is susceptible to reconduce not directly racism but racial categories and how it. Okay, so this is my. I hope I was clear, but this is my interest of this Foucauldian notion of normalization. It is a book called it is a course called Security, Territory, Population.
All right, thank you very much for that. Up next, Dr. Kevin Haggerty.
Okay, thanks to both of you. My question to start, at least, is for Guillaume. Was I correct that I heard you said you had over 2,000 interviews?
Yeah, but it's not my interviews; it's a collective.
Okay. So I guess that's impressive and startling. I guess the question I have is, can you just say a little bit about the pragmatics of working with that large of a data set in terms of managing it, but also analyzing it, making sense of it? You mentioned Atlas. I guess my more focused question is, if that's the analytical tool that mediates your relationship with the data, does that structure the type of questions, or can you use completely exploratory, open focus questions, or do they have to be more structured? So I guess the pragmatics of working with and making sense of that large of a data set.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much for this question. There are two things, because I performed myself part of the interviews, so it was 30 interviews, which is more modest. And these interviews, I analyze them, how could I say that, like the old-fashioned way. But I would defend this old-fashioned way, so to speak, like reading and rereading and being very exploratory, but you can have some objectivation. You know, the problem that I have often is that I see like analysis of interviewees which are quantitative, and why not, and some which are not quantitative at all, but sometimes you like simple indication of quantities, or indications like, I'm telling you that this was not in my interviewees, and I check that no interviewees talk about it, for example. So this is for what I said about the banlieue neighborhood in Grenoble. Okay, and what I do when I do this kind of qualitative analysis, if I say, okay, this so to speak, this hypothesis, there is nothing about this thing, I try to reread my interviewees, checking that it is not in the interviewees. And often you will have to say, okay, 2 or 3 people are talking about it, even if it is not. But for the collective work, it was very different, and nobody has a read of all the interviewees. Maybe it is a shame. It's still possible to do it. So we use the software, and we had a long collective discussion about the category of analysis and how we interpret what people say, and we finished to have a typology. this is hard to say. We had someone who is a specialist of the use of the software, and he taught how to use it to other groups. And he told us most of the groups, they exploded because there were conflicts about how they see the analysis and everything, and they finished to they did not manage to do it. So here we managed to do it. I don't know exactly why. Yeah, I have some. There are some persons who are very involved who devoted a lot of work on making the collective think work, and they were working with the software. So I won't talk too long, but I hope I answered your question.
Great, thank you. It's like I say, it's impressive and intimidating. So thanks.
All right, thank you, Kevin.
Just one word. Yeah, and it's not thanks to me, now the coordinator of the project. It's thanks to some member of the project, and who are some girls. Maybe it is useful to note it. Okay.
Okay, next question for Ron. Did participants' history with the police or the number of prior arrests impact their understanding or expectations of police professionalism? And what challenges arose doing research with arrested persons? And that, double header comes from YouTube. Over to you, Ron.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually perfect timing right after Guillaume's answer of how we analyze data, because on the first part, I have to say on this paper, we don't know yet. I don't know yet, certainly. This is a first cut. We're really building out themes. We don't have, across both cities, prior arrest data. Because of the nature of how we were able to recruit participants in the jails. So this actually speaks to your point about the challenges of doing this kind of research in the jails. I will say we know as a percentage matter, so we do have the booking sheets, right? And so we do know that very high percentages of individuals in the jails at those times have been arrested before, right? So now the question is, great question, does increased police contact lead to very different views of professionalism, right? It's not an answer I can give you. The answer I'd like to duck it with is a little bit that, and it came, I think, in Guillaume's talk too, and saying these are not just their own experiences, these are experiences of what they've seen around them in the neighborhoods. And so we have some individuals who say, look, it's not about me when we're talking about professionalism, but I saw this happen to someone else, right? And so I'm not convinced, frankly. I mean, the data would tell me if we had it, but I'm not starting from a premise where I'm convinced that increased contact immediately changes or has direct effects on cultural narratives. But again, that's up in the air. In terms of challenges, look, the most immediate challenge is getting in, right? And so we were brought in, we're allowed to come in because of the consent decree. Getting into the jails within 24 hours in cities like Baltimore and Cleveland is otherwise not possible, right? At least as far as I know. So that was the first challenge. The second, which I think is more interesting, has to do with the spatial context in which you're able to do those interviews. So Cleveland in 2017, we were given a room and we could go to the holding cells and we could recruit. An individual who chose to participate would be brought to the room where we had water and I can't recall in that visit if it was cookies or donuts. I think it was donuts. And we were in a room alone with them. We had to keep the door, 1/10 or 2/10 open, but otherwise it was quite intimate. And I don't know, I can't speak for the individual we interviewed, but it felt safe-ish as a space. And that's in comparison to what I'm going to tell you next. I fully understand that they're still being held at that moment, right? But in Cleveland in 2019, the jail had moved and was a very different facility. In that facility, we could only interview in a room that was glass on all sides, where the guard could see in. That's a very different, couldn't hear, that's a very different context. for that interview. And in Baltimore, we were only able to do it through a glass, like in TV shows, right? Like through a glass with like a speaker, and it was muffled, and they were in the rooms in which they would first meet their lawyer, right? So obviously we weren't lawyers, we made this clear to them, but they were in those rooms. And so we're speaking through this device, well, it's not really a device, but through a hole in the glass that makes it hard for them to hear and hard for us to hear, frankly. So the challenges were often not only access, not only the circumstances people found themselves in, which were horrific, whether it's 2017 or 2019, but the circumstances that we found ourselves in as researchers, depending on the jail and its own social and spatial organization.
Thank you, Ron. The next question is from Ashley Cole, and it's for Dr. Rioux. You mentioned one of your major findings was that racial discrimination by police was not necessarily a major perception among French minority groups. Considering racial colorblindness being a pervasive component of some major global northern nations, did you consider or form a sort of racial discrimination baseline? In other words, where the French police simply reproducing societal perceptions and therefore not deviating from societal norm?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. The first thing that I must say is that there is now there is empirical evidence that there is police profiling, racial police profiling in France. There is some evidence of that. And there is also profiling of people who are dressed in a banlieue style. Okay. And it is an issue. If you compare the profiling of black and white, to say so, or majority racial minorities, racial minority members are more profiled, they are more, have more negative experiences, and there is some denial. So I want to insist on the fact that a lot of young from racial minorities, from banlieue or not, they are very often profiled. Sometimes it is some kind of, there is some kind of symbolic or physical violence, and it is a big problem, and there is some denial at the political level of this problem in France. It's very important to me to say that, because I don't want to give the impression to reproduce the denial of the problem. This being said, it is not, I think it has massive social consequences, because it is a big problem for a lot of people. But if you look at quantitative data, it is still a minority of racial minorities who have regular contacts with the police. And it is mostly, there are different reasons why it is not so present. I can only have some interpretative hypotheses, but in all the studies I conducted, it is not that present amongst members of racial minorities in the neighborhoods. One reason is that I'm not focusing on young people, and young people are more profiled, and I'm not focusing on men. Women are much less profiled. But even amongst young people, they don't say that profiling is so much their problem in general. Some would talk about profiling, and it's a big problem, but in general, it is not that much present. So there are different reasons. I think that first, I don't know if we know. I don't think we can know from the existing studies if people who is more profiled very precisely, because you can be profiled by the police because there is a police in your neighborhood. You can also be profiled because you go to the city center and you are black people in a white space, so to speak, and you are profiled. So there are many situations, and even in the banlieue, there are very different situations. One reason is that I don't focus on young people who, how to say that, who don't go to school anymore, or don't go much to school and spend a lot of time in public spaces and maybe at night. These people, I think, are the one who are the most harassed by the police, okay? And I don't deal with them. Another reason is that you can be profiled by the police without knowing, because, for example, some people told me when I was young, we were controlled by the police, but in my group of friends, there were no white people. So we couldn't say we experienced police control as a group and not as a black individual amongst white individual. Am I clear? So you can also be profiled without knowing. So this I think this is my answer if I did not miss something.
Okay, we're definitely out of time, but I wanted Ron to be able to respond to this. This comes from Dr. Luca Berardi from McMaster University, and it concerns your findings on pragmatic and relational citizenship. Luca says, I'm curious if participants in your sample talked about any boundaries to this desire to have police think broadly, of experimenting, of not staying in their lane, of going with the flow and adapting. In other words, did they raise any concerns about the potential ramifications of giving police more leeway and discretion?
I'm going to very cautiously say, not that come to mind. And I'm going to say that cautiously because it's hard to believe that in the current political context, right? So at some level, I'd want to be more certain. But there are other types of responses that speak to this in oblique ways, right? So one individual says that he found it unprofessional that at some times the cops are joking with him and then they go off and arrest him, right? So it was the sort of don't be my friend if you're not my friend kind of concern, right? And that's different than what you're saying, Luca, but it starts to speak to this question of actually, if you're going to be a cop and don't be something else, right? And that, I think that there's some bleed over there to what you're saying. So I'm going to cautiously say no, at least certainly not in any significant number, if you look at it strictly in the ways you pose. If you look at it in this other way, I think, yeah, you'll see some pieces like that. But it wasn't a kind of keep it that way. Now, outside of the professionalism question, there's also going to be a lot more to analyze, right? So again, I'm being careful here, partly because in preparation for this first talk on the 2019 data, frankly, in the middle of a term, we focused on this question. And so there's going to be a lot more context than we've been able to pull out for now.
Well, thank you very much, Ron, and thanks, Dr. Rioux. Amazing presentation and wonderful answers to the questions as well. And I want to thank you on behalf of the CCR, organizers of this conference, and thanks to everyone on YouTube, wherever you've joined us from. I also like to invite you to the next panel, which is on police practice and culture. And so on that note, thank you, and